camera does all the colors for us, the different colors, so we know what's going on.
Okay, yeah, it should be working. I think we're official. I think it's up. Yeah, there we go.
It is time?
Yep.
Okay, welcome. This is a Computational Social Science Friday seminar, and today we have Sanjay, a relatively long-term student. That's not implying that he's having problems. He just finished his comprehensive, so he's making progress. So, you're going to talk about a project.
Yeah. So today I'll talk about interlocking directorate analysis, looking at some companies out of India. So interlocking directorates are basically where boards of directors sit on different boards. So they share directors between companies. So that's what that's about. I'll go to a quick introduction, literature review, some talking about the data, some research questions, the methods and tools used, and then we'll look at some results. Some are interesting, some are obvious, but I think it'll be a good, light and interesting discussion. So, India, emerging economy, they had a 1991 external payments crisis. Basically, they had to airlift gold from the country's vaults to London in order to get an IMF loan. They had, I think, a few days worth of foreign exchange left, and India imports a lot of oil. So for that reason, the government decided to open up the economy because it was in a real funk at that point. And, so things started to change back then, and the idea was I wanted to look and see how the domination that had been previously going on through conglomerates, family-controlled, state-controlled enterprises, how did that start to change from a mainly socialist and monopolistic type of economy to a more open economy? So, as I mentioned, the interlocking is a direct interlock between two firms if they share at least one common director. Indirect interlock would be between two firms if at least one director from each of the two firms sits on the board of a common firm. But we won't look at the indirect one, we'll focus just on the direct interlocking. So, interlocking has occurred among companies for a long time. And back in '69, Dooley talks about why does interlocking happen, size of the corporation, extent of management control, financial connections, like if you have a loan from a bank, a large loan, maybe you invite one of their officers to become a director. Relationships with the competitors and other economic interests. Burt in '78 talks about how companies would interlock if another company was in some way able to constrain their profits. So like a major supplier perhaps, or a major customer or something like that. Also others talk about reduction in environmental uncertainty, and most recently Lamb and Roundy have talked about accessing information and diffusion of best practices and so on. So we'll see a little bit of everything in the evidence as we walk through it. Interlocking has been looked at in different countries, Norway, Sweden, within the US, and people have also looked at performance of companies when there is interlocking. So Day in 2012 published a paper, and Tian and Yan in 2013. They talk about the positive effect of interlocking, in other words, on performance. So a company does better in profitability if they're more interlocked. On the other hand, Fligstein and Brantley and Koivers and Mussen looked at banks in the US and Belgian companies, and they found the opposite effect. And some of their reasoning was that when directors have too many boards that they're sitting on, or other reasons why they may not be paying enough attention, too much nepotism or whatever. So the theme is, though, as these are developing economies, and these are well-developed economies. So I think there's something going on there. But Domhoff, of course, says don't read too much into it. Interlocking is more like a career move by different directors, right? They get a nice stipend or whatever to sit on a board and don't have to do a whole lot. So, 100 biggest companies on the Bombay Stock Exchange by market cap. That's what the BSE-100 is. It's kind of like Fortune 100 or equivalent that we would have here. The data for this was collected from the BSE website some time ago. So originally the data was collected back in 2011 before it went behind a paywall. I ended up having to fix some data. There were missing dates and so on. But on the whole, data was not too bad. Now, of course, you can pay to get the data. So what I wanted to look at was how is the network dominated by certain individuals or companies? How does the structure of the network change over the Great Recession time period? So that was probably the most interesting thing. I was looking to see what happened during that time period in the interrelationships between the companies. And then also, being somewhere on the network, how is that related, or how does that affect profitability, margins, profit margins, market cap, and any kind of return on equity, which is a measure of how healthy a company is. Looked at some Aura metrics, the top ranked one, which sort of has the kitchen sink in it as well. They just take everything and spit out a single metric. Looked at different cut sets. We'll walk through that. And then
define Aura for
Aura, sorry, that's it's Aura from Carnegie Mellon, the network visualization tool and analysis tool. I think it stands for organizational something. Risk analytics. Yeah, right.
It also is a play on for Dora.
Okay.
Aura, the Explorer, Dora, the Explorer.
I didn't know that. Thank
Mhm.
you. Yeah. So we'll look at market cap, sales volumes, etc., long-term performance in peaks, and then some comparisons as well. I think I still get that slide, but hopefully you can read this. The font is a little small, but looking at the top-ranked agents and organizations, so these are the three names that pop out. If you're at all familiar with India, the Tata Group is a large conglomerate. You've probably heard of Tata Tea. If you drive a Land Rover or Jaguar, Tata owns that. There's Tata Consultancy Services. They're a company around in this area as well. So you can see Tata Steel is very big, Tata Chemicals, Tata Power, they own Indian Hotels Corporation, and so on. So that's not a surprise. One would expect to see him as a top person. The other two I did not know about, but Deepak Shantilal Parekh, he's the CEO of Housing Development Finance Corporation, which actually, when I researched it, turned out to be the largest mortgage lender in India. So obviously he would be connected with a lot of other companies as well, one would think. And then Omkar Goswami, he's an academic, so he has taught at various different large universities. India has a network of IIMs, they're called, Indian Institute of Management. So that's like the premier, like people get a Harvard MBA here or a Yale MBA. In India, people get an MBA from IIM. And so he's taught at there and been a director and one of the IIM and so on. In terms of the companies, what came out was Indian Oil, a cement company, and then HDFC. We've talked about that already. So a little bit of history on the energy sector in India. Let me go back. For a long time, the energy sector in India was a state monopoly, basically. There were several companies, oil companies, gas companies, and we'll see them in a couple of upcoming slides. But they had a monopoly, so they are responsible for importing all the oil, refining it, and selling it. So it's a large market, and not entirely a surprise that the Indian Oil Corporation would be the largest, one of the largest ones. The cement was a little surprising, but India has been going through a lot of construction, lots of housing being built, lots of infrastructure being built, and offices and so on. This was just a look at the cut set to see how various companies might be connected, especially in terms of the energy. So you can see all of these are Power Finance Corporation, Power Grid Corporation of India. These are all NTPC. These are all government-owned, state-owned companies. Down here, the Oil and Natural Gas Corporation, Indian Oil, and so on. And they're all sort of connected in this one strand.
Sorry, Sanjay, what do you mean by cut set?
It's just looking at a particular year, 2010 in this case, and I think Aura defines cut set as looking at a sub-network that is connected and not connected to the others.
Okay, but it's a subgraph. So you mean it's
right,
a subgraph, but where are you cutting it? Is this the year 2010?
2010.
Is that what that is?
Just
Okay.
2010, yeah. So this is sort of getting a little bit into the more interesting part. So this is a folded network, so I reduced it to one mode, which is just the companies connected through people. And this is 6 to 10. So you can see the progression, less tightly connected, it changes over time, and then in 2010 you end up with a very tightly connected core, and then there is this strand sort of on the side, and I'll have a bigger picture of this, but there are different sectors in here, colors. The blue is industrials, red is energy, IT telecom is dark green. I'll point out, and finance is pink, so point out the ones which will go a little more into. So this is just a comparison between 6 and 10. Now you see a little more drastic change from here to here. And it's the same companies, so the interconnectivity has changed drastically. So it's almost like a effect of circling the wagons, if you will, in response to the global recession, because every company was affected by it. What we see over here is the state-owned energy companies. The Hindustan Petroleum, Gas Authority of India, National Thermal Power Corporation, Oil and Natural Gas Corporation, Indian Oil, and so on, Bharat Petroleum. Over here, what we start to see in 2010 is private energy companies. So the whole Reliance group, you might have heard of the Ambani brothers. Mukesh Ambani is the richest Indian, and his brother Anil Ambani. But right around this time, India allowed for privatization of energy companies, or private energy companies to start to come in. So what we see is the private companies are better connected into the core than the public or state-owned corporations. And part of the reason is people don't want to connect to them as much, right? Because there are options over here, and also because most of the directors here tend to be government employees and what's called the Indian Administrative Service. It's kind of like we have the Foreign Service here, right? It's a whole cadre of people that go through. But that's an interesting thing to look at. So, looking at overall metrics across the years, the density goes up only slightly, but the network centralization goes up quite a bit. We saw that in the picture. And then the connectedness, of course, goes up and the fragmentation goes down over time. So looking at cliques, just minimum size of 5 for the companies, and I'll have a little more detail or more zoomed in picture, but you can see 2006 there are fewer cliques, and in 2010 you have a much sort of larger meta clique, if you will. And I'll have the detailed picture of it. A little hard to see, so I'll read it. But this is the clique of the Tata companies, and it's connected to this other clique, which is some other companies. So as we go into the 2010 time frame, we can see this is again Tata actually has now two separate cliques that are mostly Tata companies, and there are these other companies that have connected to them as well. And what appears to be going on here is preferential attachment to some extent, because the Tata companies are known to have good governance. They have very good reputations, and so these other companies are coming in, and here's Infosys, you've probably heard of that one. They're coming in and they're starting to connect in with that part of the network. And then over here is what's called the Birla Group. That's another family, like the Tatas. They have their own set of companies. You've probably heard of Bajaj Auto, if you're all familiar with India, but they own that. Anyway, so these are the Reliance group of companies. So we're seeing, family-oriented focus over here. Reliance is all kind of together. That's another family, the Ambani brothers. This is the Birla Group, and this is the Tata Group. So, despite the liberalization of the economy, 2010, it's about 20 years since it started. The family-owned conglomerates continue to be strong and quite viable. So looking at market cap to see if the companies in the middle tend to have a higher market cap or not. No, not really. There's the large state-owned energy companies. They have large market caps. Of course, energy are the largest, and then are the banks, and then the Tata Consultancy, tech company, and then Infosys. Those are large market caps. By sales volume, again, because monopoly is going on here, so they tend to sell a lot of oil. India is pretty energy hungry, so does Reliance. They have a large sales volume as well. But being in the center doesn't seem to have a lot of impact on that. Profitability. So profitability seems to again be not really impacted by being in the core or not. The energy companies are quite profitable. So in India, another thing about the energy part is the price of gasoline at the pump is regulated by the government. And so the companies have to buy on the open market and then sell at a regulated price. So in some cases, when prices fall, they will make a lot of profit. Right? If prices on the global market fall, they're still selling at a higher price, so they'll make a lot of profit. But the opposite can happen as well. So in this case, I think 2010 was probably, this is all 2010 data, it was probably more of a case of oil price being lower at that point than what they may have been allowed to sell at. So prices always tend to go up in India as far as gasoline is concerned. They never come down. There's a very sticky nature of that. Profit margins, again, not any real indicator that being in the middle tends to give you better profit margin or not. However, if you look at the return on equity, the orange line is the core companies. So taking just a sample of 12 companies in the core and 12 in the periphery, looking at the average return on equity, there's a large gap between those companies that are on the periphery and those that are inside the core. And that seems to be quite persistent in 2011 to 2016. And I took this data as sort of beyond what the analysis had been looking at. So the graphs were showing through 2010. So it's companies that were very well connected back then, looking at them 6-7 years out, 2011 onwards, so 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 years, all the way 7 years out. The ones that are in the core are doing quite well. So this matches up with what Day and Tian and Yan found in their papers that they had in 2012 and 13, that performance is better for those that are better connected in the interlocking directorate. But something interesting happens here. You might have heard in the news, 2016, November, there was a surprise demonetization in India that occurred. What that means is all denomination bills that were 500 rupees and 1,000 rupees were declared invalid overnight. They were no longer accepted legal tender. And you basically had a few months to turn in your cash. So it would be like the $100 bill and the $50 bill here became no non-legal tender overnight. It would no longer be accepted wherever you go. So what that did is many things. One, the idea behind it, actually, back up, was to find the so-called black money in India, which is the shadow economy. People, taking bribes, people making illegal money and stashing it, not reporting income to the government, and all that sort of stuff. The shadow economy. So the rationale or the reasoning was, by doing this, because to hoard cash, you need large denomination, right? It doesn't make sense to hold $1 bills. $100 bills is what you want to hoard. People would be forced to bring that out into the system. But that's not what happened. Because people are given time to turn in their money and then get new denomination notes, the higher ones, that were released a few months later. I think analysis from the Reserve Bank of India, which is like our Fed, showed that almost 99.67% of the money came back that was in circulation. So the net result was it was ineffective, the demonetization. But what that did is it caused a dip in the GDP, of course, because one, economies, the whole economy it's very cash based, so it slowed down, right? You cannot buy big ticket items anymore easily. And people had to stand in line for hours and hours at the bank to deposit their money so that later on they could withdraw it back.
If your argument here is that it's the GDP drop that caused the core periphery to, wouldn't there be a drop in the periphery too? I mean, they're still part of the same economy.
No, that was just an observation that GDP did drop. But what I'm about to say here is that the advantage that the core was enjoying in terms of being on the inside and having inside information starts to disappear here. So in an economy like India, which is still not a fully transparent, fully open economy, being connected, just like in China, being connected is quite important. It's about who you know, right? So you know somebody, you have the inside track on large government contracts perhaps, or you know what kind of new legislation is coming out. That's being in the know. So that seemed to have been working for these guys up here all these years. But then when the surprise demonetization, which nobody knew about, came out, then their advantage seems to disappear. They're having trouble doing business as well, just like everybody else. Maybe not these guys so much, but that's at least what
So
I think is happening.
I'm struggling with this because you're then making the assumption. First of all, how are you defining your core and periphery?
So
EI index?
no, just looking at the core here versus. So this is
Okay,
the,
so it's
this is the
arbitrary.
core. It's more visual than
Okay. So-
quantitative based, but this is the periphery, right?
Here's what you're arguing, Sanjay, and I just want to point that out to you
Yeah.
in case you take this further.
Sure.
You're saying that the core that you've arbitrarily defined versus the periphery,
Mhm.
which is the remaining arbitrarily defined group, you've defined it so well that you've discovered all the people who are connected to the government versus all the people who are not connected to the government that would know about legislation, that it's binary. What you might expect to see is that maybe the periphery suffers less than the core, because the core has that advantage that you're talking about, but they have to still suffer, right?
Possibly. I mean, they dip a little bit, but not a lot. You know, maybe they don't have as much to lose, if you will. Whereas these guys have a lot to lose because they have that the advantage gap narrows, right? So now everybody has a more of a level playing field. At least that's the assumption and
So
argument.
none of the
I'm making.
directors of the core that you defined are on the boards of any of the firms that are on the periphery?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I mean, they are, right? Some of them obviously are. Otherwise, you know, if we consider this to be the core,
Yeah.
right? Some of them are connected to the periphery companies, right? There are interconnections.
Okay.
But
So
you know, this is not one piece of information that these guys are probably trading.
No, no, no.
Right? It's
Fair enough.
many pieces of
But
information.
if you draw a circle around your core, I'm sorry, this is my last question.
No,
If you draw a circle around your core right now, which
Yeah.
is what you're doing right now,
Yeah.
that core is connected to what I am guessing 95% of your entire network,
Mm-hmm.
except for the government energy firms that you have up there,
Right.
which are only about 5 out of the 100.
Right.
That core is connected to your entire network. So those directors that are on those boards are integrated into the whole network.
It's connected
So
by 1 or 2 degrees
by
out,
1 or
right?
2 degrees.
Correct. Yeah, I mean here. If
But mostly
right.
by 1 degree.
Yeah,
Mostly by 1.
1 degree from here to here, right?
So those board members, if they hear about something,
They would
the
share.
board, they
Yeah.
would share it. So anyway, so I've made my point.
Okay. I mean, point taken, but it seems to me it seemed to be one explanation as to why there might be something different going on. That's just an event that occurred, so that's why I put the vertical line there. There could be other reasons why this dip occurred, right? But the dip is there in the actual data that is out there on the return on equity of these companies. So that's just my theory at this point.
Can I ask if the demonetization affected cash transactions, I would think the biggest companies would not have large cash transactions. Would they be mostly contracts, checks, electronic funds transferring, not cash?
True, but if they're in any way selling to consumers,
Consumers, then they're
that's
gonna be
all cash
affected.
transactions basically.
So, can you look at those companies and say whether or not they're direct selling
Yeah,
to consumers?
I can do that. I did not do that in this
Okay.
instance, but that's a good point. I should go back and check
Okay.
to see if they're mostly consumers or not. But if we
But-
go back, a lot of these are like Hindustan Unilever. This is the Unilever company, you know, makes soap, toothpaste, you know, that kind of thing. That's consumers for sure. Hotels, you know, believe it or not, a lot of, you know, not Tata Consultancy because they would have contracts, but hotels, pharmaceuticals, you know, a lot of companies eventually sell products out in cash, right? So you go to buy medicine, consumers are going to pay cash
Yeah.
more than 90% of the time, if not even more than 90, maybe more like 95, 96% of the time. So as you know, that demand sort of dries up in the economy, you know, from personal experience, my father has a bookstore and he would say that just the bottom fell out of any kind of transactions. Nobody was buying except just the basic essentials, because people needed the cash to pay for food, right? So whatever large denominations they had, they couldn't use them anymore. So any smaller denomination bills they were using to just buy gas, buy food, buy clothes that they needed perhaps, or things like that.
And I thought, what about whether the product is subscription based or one time only? Is that something you can look at?
Yeah, subscription based might be.
Could be, but there's not, I mean, certainly if you are a cable company, for example, or telephone company, or power company, but believe it or not, a lot of power bills are phone bills people pay in cash. Everything is cash based.
But I don't think that's something they would stop paying. That's
No, they wouldn't. So that's why other consumer goods that they could put off would certainly suffer. Yeah, I mean, if they have a cell phone bill to pay, if they have food to buy, if they have medicines to buy, they will continue to buy that, but they wouldn't go out buy new clothes if they could avoid it, for example. They wouldn't go out and spend money on a hotel vacation if they were going to take a vacation, for example. So, some conclusions. There's evidence of companies interlocking with other companies and sectors that could be problematic to them. This was, I didn't point out, was back here where Sterlite, which is a metals refining company, and Torrent Power, which generates power, are connected to energy companies over here. Right? So they need cheap energy. So there's the evidence of companies connected when they're constrained, possibly constrained by others. And then interlocking increases over time. As the Great Recession sort of proceeded, the interlocking increases. The Tata group of companies continues to be key players with preferential attachment, and then the long-term return on of companies in the core is much better than the ones on the periphery.
It maybe was.
Yeah, it was possibly, but so. My plan going forward is to try and get more data on this. It's behind a paywall, so I'm trying to get some funds to buy that data. But so analyze the directors network over time, increase the number of companies, look at additional years of data to see what are the longer term impacts of the 2016 demonetization, and then possibly do a model that provides for modeling where triadic closure and homophily. So that's kind of dependent on how much of the data I can get, which is now behind a paywall. So that's the general idea going forward on this. So, questions?
I have a friend with all the data for Canadian companies, or are you specifically interested in Indian?
No, Canadian companies would be good as well.
He's writing his dissertation on board interlocks.
Oh, he is?
Up in
Okay.
Vancouver.
Okay.
So I'll reach out to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Just one general suggestion.
Yeah.
For this type of analysis, the better tool than Dora the Explorer is UCINet.
So some of the pictures you saw, the graphs, the colored one, those were all UCINet.
That was NetGraph or
Right. NetDraw.
NetDraw.
Yeah.
And the good thing about that is you can provide p-values for all these things, and you can run an MRCAP regression. So.
Yeah, I did download the latest version of NetDraw, and all the data still reads into that, because this was done several years ago, but I wasn't sure if it would read in, but it did. So So I'll certainly take a look at that.
Avoid Dora.
Yeah.
For that.
Okay, will do. Other questions?
Is the paywall that the BSE-100 is behind, is that for, I would presume that's intended for commercial use, but is there an academic use
So
exemption?
I'm negotiating with them. They quoted me a price that then they reduced when I said I was using it for academic purposes. But it's still around $700, $800 for the data. So I was talking to Rob to see if there was a way that there was some funding perhaps, or I'll talk to Karen as well, maybe she has some ideas. But it would be interesting to do it further long term, because nobody has done that 10, 20 year look, 10, 15 year look, because I already have 6 to 10. If I can get through 18, that would give me 8 additional years. So that's approaching 15 years of data, which starts to become very interesting.
Is there any reason you didn't do the return of equity from 2006? I mean, you started in 2011 after your cycle, just to kind of see how if it changed.
I probably should have done that, but I did this just to see, what has happened in the meantime, right? Since the 2010 data, what happened in the future? Because after I did the analysis for the different years, I tended to focus on 2010, and then at least at that point, it made sense to look forward going out.
Yeah.
But that probably should be added to give a more complete picture, and probably to the question of is it a temporary thing, or is something else going on?
Yeah, kind of on a similar note for like the core. Did you break apart those companies just to see if maybe it's like a Unilever that's selling like soap and stuff like that really just tanked and was bringing down the average? Or was
I did look at that. So when I looked at the average, all of them were kind of high.
Okay, so that one.
The core, and then on the I sort of threw out the outliers for that purpose, just because I thought, okay, I should have sufficient companies to compare as an average, but yeah, threw out the really low performer, because there were 1 or 2 really high, 1 or 2 really low performers, which would skew the average.
Do CEOs in Indian companies move a lot, as much as American companies do?
Not as much.
More
Not as
stable,
much.
long term.
So
Part of a family.
Yeah, it's like it's not like CEOs are not as professionalized as much as a function as it is in America, where that's a good
they
job
are
title.
professionalized, but a lot of them tend to be the family owners.
Okay.
Right? But that's changing too over time.
That is changing.
Yeah. So like I think the Tata Group always used to have a family member. They tried a distant family member, it didn't work out, but they brought back the family member. So
Yeah.
other companies do tend to have more, especially the tech companies nowadays, the newer tech companies, the newer telecom companies, they tend to have more professionalized CEOs, the ones that have the MBAs, they have the experience.
Yeah.
But, these families have been in business a long time. So, like, the Tata family has been in business for over 150 years almost.
Yeah.
They set up the first steel mill in India back in the 1800s, and they're pretty smart people too. They send their kids to Wharton and to Stanford and so on to get experience, get the education and then the experience. So they like to keep it in the family, in their own controlling interests. So.
The reason I ask is multi-layer networks is really hot right now.
Mm-hmm.
Several high-profile articles published in Nature and Science,
Mm-hmm.
and you can do some beautiful multi-layer.
Yeah,
network
that was
analysis
actually
here,
actually
flows
suggested.
and board directorship on top.
Yeah.
So
So I do need to look into that. You're right. Somebody else suggested a similar approach as well. That there's been more new research done into multimodal networks.
yeah.
So no, that's certainly something I will look at. That's a good idea.
Any other questions?
Comments?
Anything online?
5 people.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you very much.